Okay, so good morning, everyone. Before we start, is there any question or anything you would like to ask so far? So basically, I'm almost done, definitely by Friday. So I would say Monday next week for sure. Probably even a little bit earlier if I manage by Friday. My plan is next week to start our lecture with like a slide with the most common mistakes that I've found. Overall, what I've seen, I was like quite pleased. I think there's a lot of you that I might say it actually goes with attendance. There's a lot of the things that we have discussed that in class or in tutorial that I can see a lot of you have picked up. I think that the main issue is about to understand how to answer certain questions, but this is something that we can work together on. One thing I wanted to say is that I've stopped marking any assignments that you would have submitted as a group or individually, just because I'm marking at the moment. But as soon as I'm done with this, I'll start sending you feedback again. Anything else? Okay, so today, we start slightly moving towards the second part of the module, where we are gradually moving from the micro view that we have taken so far to get into the macro perspective, and so understand how these things that we have seen working out as an incentive level for individual can eventually, in the aggregate, have an impact on growth. And today the lecture will be purely on empirical papers. So we will do a mini detour on randomized controlled trials. And then we will analyze in a little bit more detail a very important paper which I encourage you to read, because there's, I think it's a very easy paper. Also, the theory part is actually quite not that complicated. So that will be, for you, a very good example of how a randomized controlled trial can be carried on. So, if you have watched the videos material and you might have even read the empirical paper, in the folder, I could have put many, I chose two, mainly because one of these is super important. It's one of the few, the Shabab paper 1986, that's been carried out on plot level data. And the second one, the one in 2002, the Operation Varga paper, is because we'll look at the theory, and I thought it would be interesting for you to look at also the empirical part. So what these two papers tell us. The Shaban paper compare output and input level across plots with different tendency status. For what do they keep constant is the household, so within the same household. And so taking into account a lot of unobservable, which might be specific of the households that you may find. Now, the problem is that in this sort of analysis, you might find that the choice of the contract, it can actually be endogenous and so related to some plot level characteristics, therefore confounding the outcome that you may find. Remember that today's lecture is all about causality. Can I just ask you again, how many of you have done an econometric module whatsoever? Okay, good. So when I speak about causality, endogeneity, we all know what we're talking about, okay? The other paper that we consider look at a tendency reform which simultaneously changed two things. The legal output share, so how much you eventually are entitled to, but also the likelihood of being evicted. And so the problem is that when we change two things at the same time, we cannot really tell which one is the one that caused the outcome that we actually can observe. It's very hard to disentangle whether it was the impact of the increase in the share legally or the fact that you cannot be evicted as frequently as it was happening in the past. So because of that, now we will look at the impact and how tenancy contracts can have an impact on productivity. We have to be very sure that the impact on X, actually, on Y can be caused by this and this one only factor. Because otherwise it could be partially driven by that, and so in the end we do not know whether the change in Y that we observe has been driven by this or these other confounding factors. So the best setting to do that is eventually to elaborate, to create what's called a randomized controlled trial, or also called a field experiment. So this is something that we will see in a minute. Basically, researchers create and design specifically to reach a certain outcome, where they are able to change one variable at the time. So by construction, the impact that they want to observe on Y will only be driven by one factor. So they know that if there is any change, this is due to that, and not to anything else. Okay? In particular, this researcher asked, how important is the degree of output sharing in explaining the low agricultural production? If you read the introduction of the paper, they start by saying, especially in a lot of developing countries that we observed, we know that agriculture has a huge impact. But still, the productivity that they observe in many places is quite low. Why is that? If you remember, probably one of the first dairy lectures that we discussed, when we were looking at the principle agent modeling applied to the shared cropping, we talk about how the landlord eventually maximizes utility function to identify what's the best alpha I can offer. Today, lectures is about this alpha. So you know how it gets determined. Now what we do today is to see how this percentage can affect productivity, okay? With data, only empirical data. So one of the challenges that you might find related to what's the level of alpha that can eventually have an impact on productivity comes from the fact that the outcome of interest, which is our output, can be very much affected by other contractual terms and other elements which are both unobservable. And so there's a lot of elements that we cannot observe at the same time, and therefore we cannot control for. This is the first issue. There might be other choices that the tenants might do. For example, the type of technology, the type of fertilizers, how many hours to work into this, which are also eventually depending on the type of contract offered. So there's a lot of endogeneity going on. If I have to represent endogeneity in this relationship, what shall I do? What would you do looking at this? To understand the question. So we're trying to establish a causal relationship between one specific x that we have in mind, alpha share, to whatever outcome you might want to consider. Could be output, could be yields, could be, we will see how many different measures can be considered in terms of outcome. So we want to establish the relationship this way. If there is endogeneity, which is one of the challenges associated to this sort of estimates, what happens to this relationship? Econometrics, probably lecture 2, 3. This is the problem with endogeneity. That it could be actually that is y affecting one of the x's for some reason. Or there might even be other factors which are unobservable, we can call them z, which actually affects both. So the problem with endogeneity is that you cannot establish a unilaterally causal relationship between your variables of interest, between x and y. Because it might be that actually y can have an impact on x. And if this is the case, whatever outcome you obtain is meaningless. Because if your estimates are not conducted in a way that are endogeneity proof, then whatever outcome you get doesn't mean anything. How can you solve for endogeneity? In any, what are the methods that you remember that you've seen to solve endogeneity?
Difference in difference,
Different diff we will see today, but try to think to a very specific a normal estimate OLS, which is affected by endogeneity.
Is it that you find another variable that only has an impact on one and then replace that with it?
And how do we call that? It's actually called instrumental variable approach. So you have to find an instrument, IV, you might have seen specified like this, IV, instrumental variable approach, which is a technique, a way of estimate a probability model in which you can estimate your equation, which allow you to identify a variable which is not connected, so actually which is connected to the y only by a x. And so breaks this sort of bilateral relationship between the x and the y, which is what we want to achieve. Now, the problem is that finding a suitable instrument sometimes is really complicated. Why? Because lots of these phenomena are really intertwined. So what people sometimes do uses like time. So time, it could be a very good possible instrument in the sense that I can think that there might be a relationship between labor and output today, but I might assume that labor 5 years ago does not affect outcome today. So sometimes you will see that a lot of this technique, like the GMM estimator, use time lag. So the variable, in order to break this simultaneous relationship, you go back in time. And so you use this variable lagged. Type t minus 1, t minus 2, so on and so forth. But also this is sometimes a bit tricky to determine how far away back in time should I go. Shall I stop after 1 period, after 3, after 5? So that introduced a lot of discretionality into choices. One of the best way that you can find to isolate causes is actually to implement an RCT. And this is why we'll look at this technique today. How do you design a field experiment? In particular, for this sort of example that we're looking, researchers wanted to understand how a change in alpha can have an impact on productivity, which is output, risk-taking, how many risk choices you're going to make, but also input choices. Shall I choose more labor? What labor? Paid labor, unpaid labor? Shall I choose more fertilizer or other technique, other instruments? So the very good way of setting up something like this is that you can control the variation. As we said before, you're going to change one variable at a time to specifically look on the y. And so what did they do? They basically decided to agree a contract with some farmers, we will see in a minute how, and they will get paid 50% of their output to the landlord. And then the tenants, once this was agreed, were randomized in 3 groups. The first one kept the output that was promised originally. The second group discovered, after they signed the contract, that actually they will not have to pay 50%, but they can actually keep 75% for themselves. So a massive increase in the alpha that they can take. The other instead, they will keep 50% of their output, but then at the end of the first season, they will give in a lump sum payment at the end of their contract, which eventually will be differentiated between a fixed sum and a stochastic sum. Just a quick preview of the results that we will see in a bit more detail. They found that tenants with higher output share, so the one that are actually a bigger alpha, use more inputs, cultivated riskier crops, and produce eventually 60% more output to the control group. 60% is a lot. Income or risk exposure have a small effect on the output, and an increase in the output should be interpreted as an incentive effect, not an income effect. So what I'm telling you, what you've seen so far in how we calculated the alpha at the very beginning, and do you remember we said usually it can be 50-50, but there might be countries where it's actually 60-40 or 70-30 even, Latin America maybe, has a huge impact on output. So this is something that eventually can really change the type of agricultural production that you obtain. So what do they do? In order to induce this variation in a real-life setting, because this is something that we have to remember, whenever we distinguish between a field experiment and a lab experiments are conducted in specific center. A lot of universities have that, not Manchester, but for example, a very big one is in Nottingham. There's another one in Birmingham as well, where basically participants get invited and they get to play certain games. With a field experiment instead, you go actually in a real-life situation, like the one we are describing today. BRAC is an NGO that have multiple divisions in different countries. The one we are discussing today is placed in Uganda. And in particular, they lease plots to women from low socioeconomic background. So this is very poor women that eventually decided to want to start an agricultural business for subsistence or for trading. And therefore, they decided to get some land from this NGO. They also got some training and a pack of seeds for cultivation. They decided to to select 304 tenants in 237 locations. So these are villages in Uganda, in a way that you don't have more than 2 per village. And they stay together with this contract for 1 entire season. At the end of which, as we said, those that were, for example, in the control group will have to pay 50% of their output to the landlord. After signing the contract, these tenants were, and actually the villages, were randomized in these three groups. Now, in order to understand why randomization is so important, as I anticipated, I want to discuss with you a little bit really basic notion of what an RCT is. Have you done it in your econometrics module? Somebody said yes? Okay, fantastic. So whenever we want to test a policy, as we said before, it might be difficult to identify an exogenous source of variation. Exogenous meaning that we are able to establish this relationship one way and one way only. So in order to do this, we might eventually use this sort of technique, which is actually taken from the medicine. So medical doctors use this all the time to test a new drug, to test new medicine or new procedure, new protocol. The interesting part is that until probably 20 years ago, this is something that in economics no one will use. And the person that started using them and applying to economics is called Esther Duflo, Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago. Together with her advisor, Abhijit Banerjee, she's the one that eventually decided to implement and apply this sort of technique in different projects. We will discuss at the end some of the issues associated. Anyway, the idea behind the randomized controlled trial is that in order to answer this sort of question without any issues of endogeneity, we have to identify a counterfactual, which means a unit of analysis, of observation, which is exactly similar to the one we are investigating, but will differ from the one that we want to observe because of how we treat it. Okay? Think about a drug. In order to test a new drug, what do medical doctors do? They select 2 groups of people, completely random, in terms of, in order to have pretty much same composition of men, women, pretty much same age range, but again, completely random. And then to one of these groups, they administer the new drug, and to the other group, what do they administer? Placebo, okay? Basically sugar. And then after the amount of time that they think is actually, they want to take this drug to act, then they will go and test the differences. Differences in what? Differences in these 2 units of analysis, this Y, whatever outcome that you may have in mind. Let's make an economic example. So consider a research question where you want to identify the effect of textbooks on test scores. So your unit of analysis will be the observed test score for school I, YI, and this is what you will be able to observe. Then you will have the average test score of children in school I if the school has textbooks, treatment, this is why we label with a T, and then YIC, which is the average test score of children in school I if the school has no textbook. And this is what we label the control. In order to understand the causal effect of having textbook, we want to test the difference between these 2 variables and see whether this difference is significant or not. Now, what's the problem associated with this sort of way of working. That you cannot observe the same eye, so the same school, the same children, with or without textbooks. You will be only able to observe it under one modality. So what you need to do, you have to find another school, very similar for grades, for composition, for location. Think about being more in a wealthy area compared to a less wealthy area. Urban areas versus like more, probably you could say rural areas. And the problem is that all these elements, all these differences should be accounted for. You can control of them. What is it that you don't want? What you don't want is that the difference between the school that you test are systematic. You want them, there will be, but you want them to be random. Why is that? Remember that we're trying to understand why it's so important to have, this is actually the first letter of the type of treatment, type of technique, research technique that we discussed today. Randomized controlled trial. Please. Can you tell us a bit more?
If you randomize your selection, like your expected difference in the absence of, or your expected average in the absence of the treatment will be zero if it's randomized.
On will be zero on average. Okay? So that's exactly the point. So if there is any difference, we expect them on average to be zero because it's random. So there will be one time there will be an upward bias, another time will be a downward bias, but in expected terms, that will be equal to zero if it's random. Otherwise, that introduces like a drift, so like a consistent upward bias or downward bias. If this is the selection of the people that get into treatment is not correctly done, meaning randomized. So, because this is so important, whenever you want to compare the unit of analysis with and without treatment, you want to do that in expected terms. Why? Because if you remember the expectation operators, this one here, E, is actually equal to sum, like a big sum, capital sum in I, from I that goes from 1 to n, divided by the number of n. So basically what you're taking is an expected average. So the difference between these two in expected terms will give you the average of types of school with and without textbook. And this is the difference that that somebody mentioned before, like a technique that we can use in order to block or reduce probability of endogeneity. So if there is no systematic difference, but it's actually a randomized control trial done in a very good way, you will be able to eliminate this selection bias. And eventually we'll be able to control for any specific individual characteristic that your unit of analysis might be. So for example, the location of this particular school, the number of students, the number of grades. So if the randomization is done correctly, the treatment and the control group do not differ in any possible way apart from the treatment that you have imposed. And that could be anything. Could be the allocation of bed nets, could be the allocation of specific vitamins, it could be the allocation of, like in this case, a specific contract agreement. So this is eventually what you're going to estimate. And as you can see, the average of the outcome is actually conditioned on the type of treatment that you will be having. So either treatment or control groups. If this difference is significantly different from 0, and you can test that, it means that your treatment is the one creating the difference. So working or not working, or you can actually quantify how big is the impact that you actually are imposing. What are the critique to the randomized experiment? So one, and probably the most important, is the external validity. How can we use the results that we learn in Kenya for one specific program in a specific rural area, how that would be meaningful if we change setting and we go to, I don't know, a region in India? Will we get the same results? Can we learn something? Can we extend the learning that we get from any RCT in any other location? What do you think? Is it still worth doing it? Or do you think that the learning that you get is so small or so specific that there's nothing that we can really extract and make more general? What do you think? No opinion on that?
It can be good for showing comparisons from various sort of things. I don't like to, actually looking at what Kenya and Africa, for example, you compare those to, South Asia, for example, and then see similarities, those general trends, and differences in large areas.
Anyone else? I'll answer to this question in the way that Esther Duflo replied when she was given the Nobel Prize, and lots of people question, this type of technique, and actually it was a very controversial prize assigned. And she would say, well, I'm not sure how much I can generalize in another country, but I know that what we learn, the little that we learn from this RCT is still better than learning nothing about that specific country or that specific program. In the sense that there's a lot of critique at the moment by using any sort of results or macro results that use OLS. Why? Because if you talk with some of my colleagues, they will tell you that actually those estimates are just useless. Why? Because they're all so full of endogeneity, especially if you look at the developed economy. There's a lot going on that you actually will not be able to disentangle that in any possible way. And they will tell you, especially this is micro and econometrics people, that the only way actually to learn in an environment which is free from endogeneity problem is actually via RCT. So I sort of agree with this in the sense that I still think that learning something about a tiny place or a program which dealt with a specific thing is still better than not knowing anything about that. Even if the chances of generalizing things might be actually quite complicated. And this is why you will see that a lot of the papers that get published today, especially with RCT, they have like a research question and then you have evidence from. Because, depending on whether they're carried on, you may have actually different sort of outcome. One of the other issues that you might have is the implementer effect. Because you need to go, especially when it gets to field experiments or randomized controlled trial, you have to be on site. You need the help of the local NGOs. And this very much depends on who you find that can actually partner with you when it comes to implement this sort of things. And it could be that actually the type of implementer that you use is the one that makes the difference. So it's not actually the research question or the program that you are doing, but it's actually how effective is the NGO that you're using. And this is where there might be a sample selection effect or a selection bias effect. in the sense that maybe the NGOs that want to participate are the one that are actually more competent, they are more transparent when it comes to procedure, and so these are the one that makes the difference, not really your idea. And I've included here some reference if you want to look at that into a bit more detail. Then there is another issue which I found for experience that I will tell you in a minute, a little bit tricky. Is randomization fair or unfair? What do you think? Yeah.
You could say that, like, if you're going to spend money on a random control trial, it means that, like, half the people aren't going to get treatment. Do you think you're going to have to be so much more ethical to spend your money on giving the treatment to as many people as possible?
But then you will have no control, right? So this is exactly the problem. So the example that we are studying today is a little bit less sensitive. Why? Because we're talking about contract agreement, and so this is something very, although it might have a lot of personal consequences, this is really pretty neutral when it comes to the type of the unit of analysis, which in this case are the tenant. But there might be other programs. Think about programs that include children, think about programs that include vitamins, that actually, or specific vaccine or supplements that can really make the difference between keep going, being alive or not. In order to find a control group and to test the validity of this program, there will be somebody that is actually excluded from this. And that generates a lot of debate when you have to select randomly who's going to get it and who's not. And if you think about the type of numbers that we're dealing with, even today, we're talking about quite few units, so 230 villages, one person or two max. So we're talking about probably 400 individuals that at the end of the program, at the end of the season, you will know really, really well, personally. And it's not so easy to say, no, you're not going to get it. So this actually makes the creativity of the researcher to kind of think about how to go around ethical considerations. And I'm telling you one that I've been involved with, because I think actually we did it in a quite good way. And I must say that the UK, for that reason, is a lot more careful with ethical committee, ethical boards, compared to the US. So a few years ago, I was involved in RCT, so randomized controlled trial, that provided orthotic equipment to Ugandan people with polio. So we were staying in the University of Kampala, actually the hospital of Kampala, and we were treating people with disability. Now, in order to randomize the sample that we get, we collected unwanted orthotic equipment from British hospitals that were still in very good use. And we decided to match them with the type of disability that the people that will come to us to get treated. So we put an advertising campaign, and so we used NGOs, local NGOs, the local hospital in Kampala to spread the news that at that point in time, for a month, there will be a team of researchers that can offer completely free of charge the equipment for the disability. Now, of course, as you can imagine, we had to have a control group in order to see the impact of this equipment on people's mobility, possibility to reach certain places, and probably, increase the demand for work or studying. So if that will actually get their life easier, and therefore to be mobile around, and therefore they were looking for more jobs opportunity or more training opportunities. So for doing that, the first year we treated only the person that had a match with the equipment that we brought. But then what we did, we collected basically individually, so by individual, the type of disability that they were having. And so we came back the year after to treat all the people that were in the control group the first time. So that eventually, all the people that were in our study sample treated and controlled in the time and the span of 2 years, 2 years and a half, were actually treated. No one was left out. And this is something that requires, as you can imagine, a lot of thinking, a lot of resources, but I'm making you this example just because it's a type of example that I know quite well, that I participated with, and we thought a lot, how do we do to make sure that everyone that we will actually interact with will get treated, will get help at some point. So there are ways to accommodate that, not always possible, but there are ways. One of the other features that you might have noticed because of the papers that you might see in journals, that the majority of these RCT are conducted in developing countries. And so there's a lot of people that says, well, how do we read this thing? Somebody, as I wrote down here, might be like a more generous interpretation for the type of condition of the setting. These are the environment where it will be actually easier to identify specific aspects and to discuss specific sources. Other people will say, well, actually, it's a place where usually to conduct a RCT is cheaper compared to the UK. And you could see that in any lab experiment which is conducted mainly among students, university students. And so, and also there are less review boards that when you get on site will screen the type of intervention that you do and will check what is it that you're actually coming to do here. I must say that the country that I visited for, that was pretty strict. And so that sort of second comment would less apply, but I only have done a few. And there were lots where probably the ethical checks and committee might not be as thorough as the one that you will get in a developed country. Any question? I'll stop here for a break, and then we'll see the results of the paper, okay? Sure.
What's
Yes.
the code?
What?
The code for the seats?
There.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Is it only the person that submits them that can see the answers?
Yes.
Feedback. Okay.
This is how it's
So
designed.
there's no way to change that, is there?
So I asked for a different thing. Apparently, this is the best they can do.
No, it's okay.
So it will have to be the person that submitted to get the feedback and share with the group.
No, yeah, that's fine. Because he does share it, but it just would be easier ideally, but it's okay.
They have been making a lot of resistance for this, and I'm not sure why. For next year, they're going to change the system, so it's going to probably, I heard, to be easier. I'm not sure. You're welcome.
Oh, I'm dying. Why not?
Guys, shall we? Shall we start again? Okay, so now that we are a little bit more familiar with the effects of randomization, let's go back to our example. Let's see how and what they find. So, as you will see in the RCT design, that, as I said, I'll encourage you to read, the tenants were contracted for 1 season under a sharecropping contract that gave them 50% stake in the output. So this is what they sign up for. Once they have been, once the agreement have been signed, they were randomized in these 3 different sort of treatment. The first one, we can call a control group, and this is the group that exactly got what they signed up for. So 50% of the output. Alpha equal to 50%. Then there is the first type of treatment. So once they have agreed to sign up and get like a 50% sharecropping type of contract, they say, actually, no, there's a mistake. We are changing your condition, and rather than 50, you're going to keep for yourself 75% of the output. So this is an important thing. You can only change the percentage after they signed in a way that will make them happier, that will make the tenant better off. So it wouldn't have been possible to have, rather than 75% from the 50, a 35%, okay? So that would have been something completely unfair, but anything going higher up that will make the tenants better off is actually doable. And then there's another group. This other group agree to 50%, and this is what they will get, but at the end of the first season contract, they will get an additional fixed payment, which is independent of their output, and as we will see, this could be either stochastic, so with certain probability, a lottery, or could be a lump sum certain outcome. Why do you think it's important to have T2? T1 is pretty easy, okay? So we want to see the effect of an increase in the output share on the productivity. What is it that we're testing T2 for? What is this lump sum doing? Yes?
So, it's to rule out endogeneity in how more effort would, based on the output, more effort would yield more output, would yield higher benefits.
I'm just giving you a lump sum of money, yeah? So you keep the 50% share that you will have to pay to the landlord, at the same time keep for yourself, but I'm topping that up with a payment. Yes?
Incentives effect and income effect, maybe, to separate them?
Why? Why could be important? Yeah? What is it, the underlying principle that eventually more money, fixed money or lottery money will solve? What is it that I might be afraid as a researcher that there is something going on which actually can prevent you to invest in some kind of fertilizers or risky crops or any other choice of input that you might think of? What is it that I'm thinking if I'm testing this too? This is the, I want to do this exercise with you guys because the one thing I want you to get out of this room with is that designing an RCT is really a complex thing to do. And you have to really think which question are you answering and what would be the best way to get the outcome that your question wanted to answer from the very beginning. Because the problem is this, if this is not really well thought through, you might get answers to questions that you haven't thought of, or, and this is the worst part, you might not get the answer that you wanted because your question was not designed in the right way, or your game, or your RCT. So depending on whatever type of experiment that you're running. Okay? So this is something extremely complex. If I'm giving you a lump sum of money at the end of the first season for another season, and you know that from the very beginning, so you know that this will happen in t equal to 0, so when this change in percentage, for example, is announced, what am I afraid of that you might be going through, that this lump sum of money can solve?
And people might be in kind of a less hard, and then they're going to get more money for everything.
But I'm just giving you that, right? So what am I trying to cure?
We can sort the uncertainties in incorporate and prepare for constraints that are.
I'm trying to solve the possibility of a financial constraint. The fact that there might be some sort of credit market issue, you cannot borrow money, you would like to invest in a new seed, in a new fertilizer. You would like to pay somebody to work on your field for 3 hours a day and top up what you can offer already, but you are financially constrained. So let's see, if I give you some money for free, whether that will be something that you will invest in your production, in your agricultural production, or not. So one is the incentive effect, the one that you could see in T1. I'm changing this share from 50 to 75. But the other is this sort of financial constraint going on. If I'm giving you this sort of lump sum of money, what would you do with that? What will be the effect on the outcome? And then, within this sort of financial constraint aspect, they differentiate even further. And what they do is that alpha, the tenant, treatment 2A, receive this risk-free cash, whereas the other one, T2B, they get a lottery. So with some probability, they will get some money. With some other, they will get something else. Okay? In order to do this, in order to check these results, there's been lots of visits to the plots, and every time the researchers were collecting information. So information on the output levels, information on the crop choice. All the tenants were surveyed in order to get specific characteristics. So for example, the level of education, how many hours they were working, the type of fertilizer, so anything that you can think of that will be and can proxy for individual ability. Because remember that in the end, this is something that we cannot observe, right? So this unobservable that we talked about before has to do with the ability of every single person. Is that due to I work harder because of that, or it's just that I am a much better tenant? So if we will have to think about, differentiate, and eventually summarize the type of research question that this pool of people wanted to explore in this RCT, I want you to remember these things. So first of all, by doing a randomly, by assigning randomly every tenant to the specific treatment, they basically solve any sample selection that you might have. So any unobservable characteristics that there will be and will differentiate tenants will be considered completely random. And this is true also for time preferences and risk preference, which is something that eventually they are able to test a little bit in the treatment too. The same contract was advertised to all group ex ante, and as I said to you before, the condition was changed only afterwards that they were already signed in a way that will improve the welfare of the tenants. And again, this sort of eliminates the fact that you might want to go for a specific contract. With T1, basically they are introducing an exogenous variation because they are the one imposing the change from 50 to 75, and they know exactly that point in time where this has happened, okay? Remember the concept of time that we said before. If something came before something else, you can identify which is the one affecting the other one, okay? So this is also very important in timing. Income effect. So by looking at the T2 sort of treatment, they are able to see how much variation in income is going to affect productivity, if any, how much more fertilizer or risky crops you might want to invest, knowing that you have a sort of insurance provided by this pot of money. And then by looking at the treatments 2A and 2B, they want to really look at the exposure to risk, because now the income becomes a lottery. So how much individual preferences is something that we talk about. And if you think about, whenever we talk about preference, you have to think about the utility function. Remember that the shape of your utility function, the variable that you include in your utility function, can make the difference. Will I go for something riskier or not? And that eventually depends also by the type of person you are, okay? Despite all the condition and all the other elements that we have discussed today. To make sure that the information were checked, remember that we are in an environment where there is asymmetric information, so there might be some moral hazard going on. An individual might get an incentive to misreport what type of outcome they got. So there's been a lot of surveys, a lot of checks by the researcher in order to reduce this sort of misreporting activity. What do they estimate? So the equation that they estimate will look like this. So the individual outcome that they want to observe is Y ICT, which is for the tenant I from CLEP-C. CLEP is in some areas will basically be the same thing as a village. In season T, TIK is an indicator variable equal to 1 if the tenant I belongs to a club of treatment, so depending whether it was T1, T2, A or B, or C, and 0 otherwise. Delta S are the strata fixed effects, so there will be some fixed effects characteristic, so for example the location, the timing, that has to be fixed for any tenant considered. And lambda K is the difference between the outcome of the tenant who were assigned to treatment K and the control group. So basically the lambda K will specify the difference between the Y's that we discussed earlier on. What are the outcomes that we are looking? So these are the table directly taken from the paper, as you can see. And the first thing that we want to analyze is how the contract has had an impact on the output. And the output is measured in Y, but also like in Y divided by square meter. So how do you read this table? I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with this, but just giving you some help in this. So the first thing that you want to look at is actually the mean outcome, C, because this is the control group. And you will see that the average tenant got 95, I think it's dollars. $95 US dollars of output. Then compared to this, which is our sort of baseline, what does treatment 1 earns? And you can see that treatment 1, so the first row, excuse me, has almost $57 more on top of the 95, which is a lot, huh? As you can see, this outcome is characterized by 3 stars, meaning, what does that mean, the 3 stars? It's the significance, right? And how significant is that with 3? Very much. It's the 1% confidence in the results that you have. 2 stars is 5%, and 1 star is 10%. Okay? Respect to the T1, the T2 is actually a little bit less relevant. And as you can see, it's not even significant. So if it's not significant, what can we say about this? It's non-significant, huh? But there is still a positive $5 increase with respect to the control group. If I give you a table like that to analyze, what would you say? Does this extra income provided to you as a lump sum or a lottery change the way in which you obtain your output? Yes? No? Or? Well, not many options, eh? When it's non-significant, what do you conclude? Thank you. You can't say anything. That's exactly the point. So whatever increase, decrease, positive, negative, big, small, you can't say anything. Okay? So the only thing you can say is actually this is a non-significant effect. It might be due to the sample size. It might be simply that it's not influencing anything. But you just cannot say it. What will be your conclusion that this group of women that got this lump sum eventually are not affected by this treatment in terms of the production that they are obtaining? What does that make you think? What could be the reason why? Yes?
It provides them enough incentive to
So basically you're saying that maybe the amount of money promised were not big enough to produce any change? Could be. So there could be a size effect. We promised £20. £20 is not enough. Maybe if I promised you £1,000, I would have seen 3 stars next to the number. Something else? Yeah?
Maybe there wasn't enough time to produce a significant effect. So if it was a more long-term time, like money infusions, it would produce more effect than it did.
It's given by season, so you might expect that this is a considerable amount of time, but we don't know. It could be that actually in order to observe a significant effect, they needed more time. Anyone else? Yeah?
Maybe they didn't use the money for that part. So they just kept it to themselves. So that's not.
That could be another option. So it could be that just the money that we're given were considered a sort of insurance and were not used or didn't change any behavior associated with production. Or
could you assume that they're already working on them, like they're already maximising the amount that they can produce? So the lump sum doesn't make a difference, like they're already trying to produce as much as they can.
this is all good sort of options, good possibilities, as in order to test exactly, they would have probably need further explanation. What they do conclude eventually is that actually the type of tenant So the individual characteristic of the tenant that was selected, so it's somebody that didn't have any training before as a farmer, didn't have any experience, so didn't know really what to do with this extra money that were provided. So as somebody said, they didn't enter in the production process at all. But maybe because they were risk averse and so they kept the money, that we don't know, or simply because they didn't know what to do with that. Because remember that we're talking about a very specific group of women with certain features. So it might be, for example, that if you run this RCT in another location with other tenants with different characteristics, you will get a different effect. And this is also something that I want you to draw the attention on. Whenever you will read this sort of paper, you will see that in the end, people is very cautious, is very specific about the policy implication that they draw. Because remember that this is what we do this research for. Eventually to inform policy makers, to inform a professional that actually do this sort of changes, this sort of program. And whenever you kind of inform this professional about this, you have to be very, very careful. This is what works in this setting under this environment. And if you remember, this is something that we discuss also for the theory. You have to remember which is the environment in which you move, the assumption that basically constructs the framework in which you operate. And so the outcome that you get is very much dependent on this assumption. And for the empirics, that's exactly the same. So to summarize, we have seen that the average control group had a $95 of production on average. Respect to that, the tenants that were in treatment 1 had $56 on top of that on output extra on their plots, meaning, as we said from the very beginning, almost 60% more of output. But the difference in terms of the T2, so the treatment on the income effect, was less imprecise. They say more imprecisely estimated, so you can't really tell anything about this. No difference, no significant difference, even between the T2A and T2B effect. So not only the income effect didn't work out on the output produced, but they cannot really tell the difference between providing this sum as a fixed payment or as a lottery. So as if the risk profile of the tenant didn't have really a huge impact. We said this, and so let's have a look on the inputs. So once we have seen the impact on the output, now the researcher focus on the impact on the inputs, and they look at capital inputs and labor inputs. For the capital inputs, they look at fertilizer, insecticide, tools, and this is a combination of the one that we just mentioned. They look at this variation both at the extensive and the intensive margin. Do you know the difference? Especially when it comes to labor supply, what will be the extensive margin and what will be the intensive margin? Any idea? So if you look at the extensive margin, you're basically looking at a variety of things. So you look how many different type of jobs you might want to do. If you look at the intensive margin, you're looking at how many hours you're actually working. So it has to do with the number of hours that you're actually working on. As you can see, there are very, very few stars here, mainly at the intensive margin on the tools used. And they conclude that only 28% of the tenants in the control group reported using any fertilizer on their plot. As we said before, this might be due to the type of training that they received, to the type of experience, or to the type of the individual characteristic of this tenant. Tenants in T1 were 9.4 percentage points more likely to use any type of fertilizer. So those that had a higher share, so they had the alpha equal to 75, eventually use more fertilizer. So there is sort of an impact towards using riskier sort of tools. Again, for T2, the impact is not observed. Positive, but not statistically significant, and so prevent us to conclude anything. The effects on the labor inputs, again, you can see different type of labor. So one is the own labor, so the one that you actually exercise on your land. And then there's paid and unpaid. What is it, the unpaid work? Paid, you're basically hiring somebody for the day or for the season to come and work with you. What is the unpaid? Say it out loud. Family. So here we're talking about mainly children that work on the land or female. Uganda is not as big on polygamy like other countries, like Nigeria, for example, or Benin, which is another state with a high rate of polygamy, but still there will be, especially in the Muslim part, a lot of polygamous households. And one of the reasons behind polygamy is actually the possibility of having free unpaid labor to work on the agriculture. So could be wives, could be children, any of that. As you can see, again, very few positive stars, actually very few stars at all, just one in the treatment one for the unpaid labor. So it seems that neither in T1, treatment 1 and treatment 2, people spend more time or more hours working on the plots relatively to the tenant in the control group. So summarizing these results, we can see that the output share, whenever it goes increased from 50 to 75, leads the tenant to a massive increase in the output, final output. Some of this is due to investing in riskier inputs, especially fertilizers and tools, which is the one that had like a big positive effect, and eventually to take more risks, so possibly having and treating, cultivating riskier seeds. The effect of the income is not very much observed for all the reasons that we mentioned before, and also probably due to the individual characteristic of the sample in this study. But what is interesting is that you can see very well how, by making a contract which improved the position of the tenant and allow them to have a lot more control, a lot more say in these contractual terms, eventually leads to a much better agricultural techniques, probably a little bit more risky, but definitely more productive. And this is, I think, a great way to end our part on agricultural production. So you've seen how this sort of percentages gets chosen eventually, how to a maximization process, but eventually now you can see how much they have an impact in reality. This is a real study with real people in a real country. And this is the outcome that has produced. Any question? Yes?
Have there been other studies that have found like different outcomes?
Yes, and I think that one of this, so do you mean specifically on sharecropping? There are many experiments. I think this is probably the one that has been conducted in a more rigorous way that I could cite to you. It's published in one of the best journal in economics, which is a huge aid. And so if I have to cite one, I'll definitely go out with this, because being a field experiment, all the other studies, some of the one that we discussed, but there are others, there can always be confounding factors. In an RCT, they were able to isolate specifically what is causing what, which is the causality point. So the answer is yes, there are other studies, not as rigorous as this one. If you want, guys, I can provide you more. I think one of this is also in the blog post that I share with you on Vox EU. I don't know whether you ever visit this sort of blog page, but they do something really nice, which is making research accessible to a wider audience. And every now and then you can come across nice studies like the one that I shared with you. Any other question? Right, so before you leave, and this is why I left some space today, I like to do here and now, please, this 1-minute survey. Do it on scrap paper, and please, when you leave the room, put it inside here. I want to get some feedback on the things that we have been doing together, and I want you to do it literally in 1 minute, okay? So do not overthink about it, but please answer these 3 questions. Thank you. For me, it's very important because I get feedback on which I can think of, reflect. Guys, please, it's still lecture time, okay? So I just want you to do this quickly but effectively. Yes. I don't. Can you ask? Do anything about this. So rather than sending you another survey, I want you to do while you're here. Quickly, so it has to be done really 1 minute without too much thinking about it. This is anonymous, I forgot to say, so feel free not to write anything else apart from this. Sure. It will be in the bag, so anyway. We can close it up. Thank you. Thank you, girls. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I had a question about
Sure.
the first table. I was just confused about how you interpreted it. So like the first one. I was just a bit confused like what the stars were and how like
So the stars mean how strong and reliable is your result. Okay? And these results came out of a normal distribution. And the stars basically describe which is the level of confidence with which I can take this effect that I observe. 3 stars mean 1%. I'm leaving out 1% of the distribution, so really detailed, rare event. 5% I'm leaving out a little bit more of the distribution. 10% I'm leaving out a lot more. Okay? Meaning that it's still significant, but not so strong. 3 stars meaning that you're leaving really, really few things out, which means your result is really strong, it's really reliable.
Okay, and then so from the stars, they noticed that the T1 group were the ones that exerted the most highest output.
Yeah, so basically, compared to this, which is the baseline,
Oh, okay.
I can see that they had 57% more
Oh, okay.
compared to this, which is a lot,
Yeah.
almost 60%.
Okay, I got it. I didn't
You got
understand the mean that was at the bottom and then
Right,
the
yeah,
reference.
this is the mean outcome, the control
Yeah.
group,
Yeah.
okay?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Alice,
Hi.
can I see the seats code, please?
Sorry?
The seats code.
Sure.
I couldn't read it from all the way back there. And it doesn't work on my phone for some reason.
Yes, it's here, it's here.
788-394.
788-394.
394. Let me just make sure that works.
Thank you guys for doing this.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Miss. See you later.
Sorry, I have a couple of questions if that's alright.
Yeah.
So just on this slide here, from
Thank
the
you.
randomized experiment study and the question of whether it's valid across country by country basis. Have studies been done to compare to regions from a similar background, so i.e. the same country, and if compared on a global basis where some countries do it within those cities and then compare the results internationally, would that not be sufficient enough?
So this is done within Uganda in different regions.
Yeah.
Okay? Which have been selected for similar characteristics. So we're looking at probably the same amount of rainfall, the same sort of rural environment versus urban. So something that is comparable, because we want the control and the treatment group to be as similar as possible. Now, there is one study which I found quite interesting. They wanted to observe the impact on cameras in school. So basically, they were. Thank you guys. Thank you guys. Thank you very much. So they wanted to observe whether the teacher's presence was actually improving the exam results of these kids, these children. And how would you ensure the teacher's presence? They were taking a picture of the teacher in the morning and in the evening. Now, the way in which they thought about creating the control group it was quite clever, because they didn't want to, they weren't quite sure about finding, this was done in India. They weren't quite sure about similar location, and so they decided, you know what, let's do it with another city in Bangladesh. So another country which had very similar characteristics to the one, I can give you the reference for this. Very similar characteristics to the one of that village in India, and so they were used this as a control group, because they want to. The problem with this RCT that when the population knows that there will be researcher coming, immediately the news spread, and so you might have this sample selection that we were talking about. So most of the time, People do not really announce the truth about what they're going to do. So in this case, to avoid any of that, they said, you know what, let's go completely to another country. And so they went to Bangladesh. And so they were comparing this city in India with this other city in Bangladesh, which apparently for climate, geographic location, and other characteristics was very similar to the one in India.
Yeah.
And this to avoid attrition effect and all the other aspects. So I'm not sure how many RCTs you will need to carry on to avoid or to be able to say something general. That I'm not quite sure about. Is 100, is 1,000, so it's hard to pick up a number. But again, I really believe that, which is the reason behind she getting the Nobel Prize, that this has changed a lot the way in which research methods were used, especially by economists.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just happy to learn a little for sure, rather than having lots of big statements that I'm not sure in the data what's going on. Think about any macro, basically regression that you can come across with. Trade growth regression. Some of my colleagues, I'm not that Taliban, but some of my colleagues would say they just don't believe in any of that.
It's fair enough.
So, because why? Because of the endogeneity associated. So this is, you know, there's a lot of people, actually the movement has grown in the last 20 years that will only say that this is the way in which you can actually, because you're controlling it, you're designing the amount of endogeneity that you want, you're creating the exogenous variation, and so because you are in control of that, you can actually get that what you observe or you obtain is reliable.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does that answer your question to a certain extent?
No, it definitely does, and I appreciate that extended perspective. And just on the second experiment, the moral hazard tenancy contracts, the strategy, I was wondering whether community information was controlled for, in a sense where if a neighbour hears that their neighbour is getting a more beneficial contract, they might feel discouraged.
No, but yeah, this is why they didn't do more than 2 per village. It's actually almost 1, so that actually you minimize the rumors that get spread, you minimize the attrition that you might have, because some people might move to different locations, different villages, because they are given that a better contract.
Who's offering the contracts?
The NGO BRAC.
But if I'm on a farm and I've already got an existing contract, then the researcher speaks to the NGO and says, we want to do this, can you offer a different contract?
Yeah. This is how, so this is where the partnership comes from. You cannot, there are areas, and I'm thinking about Nigeria just because I went there this summer, there are areas in the north where not only white people will not be allowed, but even black people of different ethnicity.
Yeah.
So there you know, and what I'm trying to do now, in fact, is see whether the World Bank will be able to go in this area, because normally no one that it's just not safe, right? So the World Bank is the one that's got definitely the better access, but BRAC is pretty big NGO, and they work a lot with this community. Uganda in that sense is safer than Nigeria because of the Muslim part and the jihad war, so Boko Haram is there, so it's a lot more complicated in the north. Whereas Uganda is fairly, I never felt unsafe in Uganda.
And that's just 2 contracts per village, right?
So, yeah, so if you think about 3, so it's
households.
actually 3.
Sorry, it's just from the notes. You mentioned that it's why they didn't do more than 2 per village. I'm not sure what the 2 refers to.
2 tenants, 2 contracts.
Tenants.
Yeah. 2 selected tenants per village.
Tenants.
Or club, how they call it. I'm not sure what they call it club, because it might be that some areas were not really identified by 1 village only. So it's a unit of analysis. So that you have 1 person in the entire community having this, a maximum of 2.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask, obviously, like the RCT, RCT?
RCT, yes.
It's like very thorough, but I don't know, when you're looking at the regression results, would they not have been disappointed? Because like when I've run regressions and I've got like I put in so much work and like so many variables, and then I get like it's not statistically significant. Like then I felt quite disheartened. Like
Sure, I know only one of these guys on this paper, and I can ask to Celine whether he was disappointed. The problem is that, and this is something which is not always easy to disentangle, whether there's no effect or you haven't designed the question or the experiment thoroughly enough that didn't allow you to pick up the effect. And the problem is that these are very expensive, so we're talking about really hundreds of thousands of pounds. And so it's complicated to rerun. But now there's a lot of, so at the beginning, 20 years ago, when this came out first, there was a lot of heterogeneity, people doing all sorts of things, and they were publishing these results as this is the new, we've found a miracle cure for this or that. Then Esther Duflo designed a guideline for running RCTs, a huge guideline where she specified how to choose a sample, how to ask the question, to do a lot of trials before. So you see that this is done on 250 units of tenants, but I'm sure they have done a lot of tests before on 50, maybe 60 out of, before you go full on, there is a lot of checks. Also with the questionnaire, also with the outcome. So there's a lot of refinement that goes from the very first stage when you start designing this. So as we discussed, there might be so many reasons why they didn't find effect in the income. If you ask me, I would say that probably the type of tenants were not sophisticated enough to understand the value of potentially, because this is all people that's never done this before, so we require completely new training. Some of them might be abused women or women that didn't have any other source of income before, single mothers. So there's a lot going on, and in order to understand the impact of this sort of extra effect, you're already talking about somebody probably with experience that has seen that before, that has done that before. So it might just be that, but all the things that you guys have mentioned could be potentially going on.
Because that's what I was going to ask. Like even